Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Right now, one of the most dominant decks in Standard are the various incarnations of energy decks, and that deck runs a mind control effect in the form of Confiscation Coup. And I got to wondering about where the Coup ranks in comparison to the mind control effects of Magic's past. A mind control effect, so called because of the card Mind Control, is an effect that lets you permanently gain control of an opponent's creature, or as long as the aura stays in play, at least in the case of Mind Control. Honestly, I'm not really sure why Mind Control has become the term for all of these effects, since Control Magic is actually the first card we saw with the effect, but after some Googling, people definitely seem to use the term Mind Control effect a lot more, and in the end, I do want the name of this video to be something that leads to more people seeing it, so I went with Mind Control in the end, instead of Control Magic, even though I think Control Magic actually makes more sense. This is an effect that shows up primarily on blue cards, though it does show up occasionally on black ones as well, and is a very powerful effect. Stealing your opponent's creature is basically a way better form of removal, because you make your opponent lose a creature and you gain one, all with one card. In this video, we're going to talk about the 10 mind control effects that have made the biggest impact on Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I determined the rankings in this list. I use a point system with Pro Tour top 8s worth 2 points and Grand Prix top 8s worth 1 point. So it's based on how good these cards have been on the competitive Magic scene. Let's go ahead and start with number 10. At number 10, we have a card from the recent past with Exert Influence. Sporting the Converge mechanic, Exert Influence was great in decks that could pay 4 or 5 colors to cast it, as it could allow you to steal the majority of creatures that were in Standard at the time. Mana was super easy in Standard in those days, with basically every deck running at least 4 colors. These decks had terrible names like Mardu Blue and Dark Jeskai, but that made for a good environment for Exert Influence. It managed to pick up 3 Pro Tour top 8s at Pro Tour Battle for Zendikar and several Grand Prix top 8s in a variety of control or mid-range decks sporting 4 or more colors. Since rotating out of Standard, it hasn't done anything, and it probably won't. There are just way better ways to steal creatures in non-rotating formats. At number 9, we have a creature that brings a mind control effect along for the ride in Kaiga, the Tide Star. An incredibly powerful card. This is because it presents a large, efficient, and evasive body that can represent a quick clock for your opponent. Normally, your opponent would want to kill a 5/5 flyer as soon as possible, but Kaiga punishes you for killing it and lets you steal your opponent's best creature. People can, of course, manufacture situations where they have 0 creatures, but if they're doing that just to avoid Kaiga's death trigger, well, you're probably still coming out ahead. Kaiga was an excellent win condition for decks that plan on getting to 6 mana. Kaiga picked up 2 Pro Tour top 8s at the Block Pro Tour Philadelphia in 2005, showing up in some mid-range good stuff decks. In Standard, it put up 2 top 8s at Worlds that same year, one in a blue-black deck and another in a blue-green mid-range deck. It was also part of the sideboard plan for Heartbeat of Spring decks, which were normally creatureless combo decks, but cited in Kaiga against opponents who were too disruptive to allow the combo to go off. At number 8, we have the original mind control effect, Control Magic, which, as I mentioned, this is probably what we should be calling these cards. I think this is especially clear from the fact that Mind Control doesn't even actually make this list, so it isn't like it's a more prominent version of the effect, which maybe you could think maybe that's why we call it a Mind Control effect, but no, it's actually a less prominent effect, but it's still the term we use. Anyway, Control Magic is a pretty straightforward card. 4 mana lets you steal one of your opponent's creatures as long as the aura stays attached to them. People knew from the beginning this effect was powerful. Stealing an opponent's Serra Angel or Shivan Dragon was obviously pretty devastating. At the very first Worlds in 1994, Control Magic picked up 2 top 8s in control decks, and at the first Pro Tour in 1996, Pro Tour New York, it put up another top 8 in a control deck. In Extended, it picked up 4 Pro Tour top 8s at Pro Tour Chicago in 1997, showing up again in various blue-based control decks. Who needs a win condition when you can just steal one, right? At number 7, we have Domestication. In a lot of ways in Magic, we have seen power creep, but cards equal to Control Magic in power level are hard to come by. Domestication costs the same, but it has the restriction of falling off of the creature during your instep if the creature you put it on has 4 or more power. Now, this means sometimes you can still use it to get a blocker out of the way, but you can't count on using it to steal your opponent's best creature all the time. Still, Domestication was a strong card in the Standard of its time, thanks in large part to Devotion to blue decks. Devotion was a Theros mechanic that wanted to get as many permanents in play with blue mana symbols on them to power Nykthos Shrine to Nyx or Master of Waves in the case of blue. Domestication provided a powerful effect along with 2 Devotion, And this was a format that was largely dominated by fast aggressive decks that domestication could steal most of the creatures from anyway. It was actually pretty good in the mirror because you could use it to steal Master of Waves and kill all of your opponent's elementals in the process. Interestingly, while sporting a pretty high score of 28, domestication never showed up in a Pro Tour Top 8 version of Devotion to Blue, and as a result, I'm pretty sure it has the highest score of any card that has never managed a Pro Tour Top 8 on my MTG Top 10s, which is a very weird distinction. So at number 6, we have a card that I debated a little bit about whether or not to include. It has an exchange effect instead of an outright gain control of effect, but in the end I decided it was close enough to make the list, and that card is Gilded Drake. It didn't ever see play in its standard or block formats, but it saw a ton of play in extended. It mostly saw play out of the sideboard, as obviously the Drake isn't so good against an aggro deck. You're usually actually going to be handing your opponent an upgrade in that case. But it is pretty good against decks trying to go big with creatures. Despite not being good against every kind of deck, it did see some mainboard play in extended because there were decks that could just tutor it up. Survival of the Fittest was one of the more popular ways of searching it up, as was Vampiric Tutor. The most impressive finish it ever had was at Pro Tour Houston in 2002, where 3 of the top 8 decks were running the card somewhere in their 75. More recently, Gilded Drake has seen play in Legacy, where it's a good way to counter creatures that are cheated into play by Reanimator decks, and is especially strong against Show and Tell, because you can immediately steal their Gristlebrand or whatever else they were cheating into play. At number 5, we have the one card on this list that is not blue, but let's be real, it's basically blue, and that is Vidalcan Shackles. A powerful artifact from 5th Dawn, the Shackles are a powerful version of a mind control effect because you can decide to release creatures from the Shackles and then use it to steal your opponent's shiny new better creature, provided you have enough islands in play. You can also steal things at instant speed, which creates a lot of chaos since you can often just steal one of your opponent's creatures and make it chump block, or even better, make it trade with the other creature. The downside to all of this power? Well, you have to basically be playing a mono blue deck or something very close to mono blue, and be playing a lot of basic lands or dual lands that have the island type. So while the Shackles is powerful, it puts a huge deck building restriction on stealing creatures, and that is a bit of a downside. But despite that downside, it has seen a lot of play across multiple formats. Not block or standard though. Mirrored block and standard at the time were notoriously fast formats which would utterly destroy you if you took off a turn to play a Vidalcan Shackles on turn 3. It saw a lot of play in extended though, in, you guessed it, mostly mono blue control decks. As time went on, it found its way into Tezzerator and Fairies as well. It put up its most impressive finish at Grand Prix Singapore in 2009, where it managed 5 top 8s, all in Next Level Blue, which was a control deck, Tezzerator, or Fairies. Basically, the Shackles were seeing play in 3 of the top decks at the time in the format, and that allowed it to put up a lot of nice finishes in the format. Once Extended was replaced by Modern in 2011, Vidalcan Shackles did continue to be a heavily played card in the format, showing up in Modern Fairies, Rug Delver, Blue Moon, and Splinter Twin. The Shackles have seen play in legacy versions of Next Level Blue and Fairies, as well as Countertop. Despite being a relevant card in Magic for about a decade, Vidalcan Shackles has not returned to the spotlight since 2015. The banning of Splinter Twin and the falling out of favor of Delver decks has not done good things for Shackles, but it is always a card that has a shot at putting up another top 8. It's just that strong. And at number 4, we have the card that prompted me to make this list, Confiscation Coup. Number 4 is pretty high up on the list for a card still in Standard. The Coup is capable of taking either creatures or artifacts, and on its own it can take things with a converted mana cost of 4 or less, but decks running this card in Standard right now have tons of other ways to make energy, and as a result, they can pretty much steal whatever they want. The Coup first showed up in a pretty energy-light deck actually, at Pro Tour Kaladesh, Grixis Control, which Shota Yosaoka piloted to a win, but since then it has pretty much only showed up in energy-heavy decks. This has included Temur Dynavolt Tower decks, the now banned Aetherworks Marvel decks, and most recently, Temur, Sultai, and 4-color Energy. The latter 3 are perhaps the most dominant decks in Standard right now, so Confiscation Coup may do some more climbing up on this list as time goes on. At number 3, we have another dragon who comes with a mind control effect, and that is Dragon Lord Silumgar. A 6-mana 3/5 with flying that can steal planeswalkers or creatures is a pretty big deal, and it doesn't hurt that it also comes with Death Touch. Because it's a 3/5 and existed in a Standard alongside Siege Rhino, it was one of the few creatures that could block and kill Siege Rhino without actually dying itself. It was also a great card at combating Gideon, ally of Zendikar, another dominant card in Standard. Stealing a Planeswalker is great, but what was really nice was stealing Gideon and using his ultimate. This means that your opponent will never get their Gideon back, and also that your creatures get the permanent +1/+1 emblem from Gideon. All of this power made Dragonlord Silumgar one of the most played cards in the format when it was in Standard. Control decks that were dragon heavy, in part because dragons were great finishers in a control deck, and in part because there were several cards that fit well in control decks that gave you bonuses if you had dragons in play or in your hand. And Dragonlord Silumgar was one of the most played dragons of this very powerful Dragonlord cycle, appearing in most decks because of how well it dealt with two of the most annoying cards in the format. Again, Siege Rhino and Gideon. It also saw play in Blue-Black Control, Esper Dragons, Abzan Dragons, Dark Jeskai, Grixis Control, and Sultai Control, and just put up great numbers while in Standard. It has never seen play in non-rotating formats, and it doesn't seem like the most likely candidate to do so because 6 mana is way too slow for those formats. At number 2, we have something that may be a bit narrow for a mind control effect, only being able to steal creatures with a converted mana cost of 2 or less, and that is Threads of Disloyalty. But 3 mana for this effect is very nice, especially in formats with powerful 2 converted mana cost creatures. It first saw play in Standard, putting up 3 top 8s at Worlds in 2005, in the same control decks that ran Vidalcan Shackles, by the way. They really like stealing your stuff, and also picked up a Pro Tour top 8 in one of the wackier decks in Magic's competitive history, Owling Mine. In Extended, where it could steal Tarmogoyf, it showed up in a lot of decks running blue as a way to deal with that problematic creature. This included blue-white and blue-green Tron as well as blue control decks. In the last day of Extended, it found its way into Fairies decks. It made the transition to Modern 2, where cards like Tarmogoyf, Insectile Aberration, and Young Pyromancer can all be stolen with it. It has also found its way into various Delver and Merfolk decks, as well as Cobblade, Jeskai Control, Splinter Twin, and Blue Moon, the last of which is its primary home in Modern right now. Threads of Disloyalty has even proven strong enough for Legacy, where it's put up a handful of top 8s. And at number 1, we have another creature who steals creatures, and in this case it is Sower of Temptation. Dragonlord Silumgar is strong, but at least he costs 6 mana. Sower of Temptation is a very strong turn 4 or earlier play, if you're lucky, as it lets you add a 2/2 flying threat to the board, who probably has a relevant creature type for your deck, and you get to move one of your opponent's blockers out of the way, or maybe steal their best creature. Sure, the Sower dies to a ton of removal, but if your opponent doesn't have that removal, they're just going to lose. And oh yeah, a lot of the decks running Sower of Temptation ran ways of avoiding removal, including Counter Magic and Scion of Una. Fairies were an incredibly powerful deck across multiple formats in the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century, and Sower of Temptation was a big reason why. The Sower was so powerful it even saw play outside of Fairies decks, even though that was their primary home. In Block Constructed, it picked up 9 Grand Prix top 8s in Fairy decks, but also 2 in non-Fairy decks. In Standard, it saw heavy play in 2 different decks. The obvious one, Fairies, but also in Revelark decks, where reanimating Sower of Temptation was a possibility when your Revelark died or when you evoked it. Being in 2 of the top tier decks of that Standard format allowed it to amass 31 points in Standard alone. Fairies were also good in Extended and in the early days of Modern, so of course it saw play in those formats too. While it hasn't seen a top 8 in any format since 2015, Fairies are still a deck on the periphery in Modern right now, with the Fairy deck running Sower of Temptation, finishing in the top 16 of Grand Prix Sao Paulo earlier this year, so I don't think we can completely count out Sower of Temptation just yet. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it so others can enjoy it too. In the comments, let me know what your favorite mind control effect is, and let me know whether you call these mind control or control magic effects too, because I'm curious. Finally, don't forget to subscribe for more MTG Top 10s. Thanks for watching.